saturated with moving images. They are no longer an event. 100 years ago, moving pictures were a miracle. When audiences saw this train coming at them, they were overwhelmed. A new art with a new power was released. This power came out of the darkness, carried on a shaft of light. It was from Europe that in the first decades of the cinema came some of the world's most powerful films. Europe led the world until the First World War. Then she was second to America commercially, but artistically second to none. In 1894, moving pictures could only be seen by one spectator at a time in slot machines. The race to project those films onto a big screen and to make a whole range of new ones was won by Louis Lumière, filmed here in the 1920s with his famous camera. Louis Lumière and his brother Auguste had one of the largest photographic factories in Europe, and in 1895 they presented a series of moving picture shows. In December came the first show for paying customers, and this was the first film, workers leaving their factory at Lyon. At this first show, only 35 people turned up. The films lasted less than a minute. Many were home movies, Auguste Lumière with wife and baby. The audience were fascinated not so much by the baby as by the moving foliage in the background, because they'd seen only painted scenery in the theatre. The first film comedy was so popular that the Lumières had to remake it. Audiences increased to thousands a day. The Lumières continued to give them familiar scenes, but when their train burst upon them in 1896, people in the front rows ducked. The Lumières were unaware of what they had started. The cinema, they said, might last 6 months, a year. But they carried on with their old ideas and developed them. A fight over a card game is interrupted by the hose pipe. The Lumières were imitated by many others, some of whom painted their film by hand. The Lumières had to fight off the imitations because they weren't the only inventors in the field. Max Skladanowski designed an apparatus he presented in Berlin more than a month ahead of the Lumière's December show, but his bioscope was an impractical machine requiring twin projectors and was soon abandoned. The Lumière camera was as portable as a cigar box and doubled as projector and printer. This Lumière shot of Piccadilly Circus was taken in 1896, the year they opened in Great Britain. After the initial show in Regent Street, they transferred to the Empire Theatre, Leicester Square, which they also filmed. The Empire was a music hall, and the cinematograph was a minor item on the bill, but it was immensely popular. Across the square at the Alhambra, 2 weeks later, R.W. Paul presented his animatograph using a newly designed camera and projector. Soon, no music hall was complete without a film show. The Lumières had to work hard to keep ahead. Cameramen were sent to dangerous and distant places, and wild stories invented to sustain public excitement. Lumiere cameramen invented the travelling shot without realising it when they mounted the camera on a train leaving Jerusalem in 1896. And the crane shot when they showed the old Trocadero in Paris from the lift in the Eiffel Tower. The British proved as inventive as the French for a brief but glorious period around the turn of the century. Their filmmakers began to join scenes together, to edit them. Bold close-ups appeared in trick films long before they were used in dramas. In this film by James Williamson, a man, maddened by photographers, decides to swallow the camera. The cinema in England gained prestige by the appearance of royalty. At Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901, the new king, Edward VII, held up the procession for a moment, the gesture passing into legend as the king pausing for the camera. The cinema at this period belonged primarily to the working class, who were often served by travelling showmen. The Sheffield Photographic Company were travelling showmen who also made their own films. Like many early English films, this was popular in America, and it influenced the famous American film, The Great Train Robbery. Most film shows were found in fairgrounds. This is the only surviving shot which shows the crowds which poured into them. A country bumpkin mocks the cinematograph until, like the Lumiere train, it proves too real. The standard of presentation often left something to be desired. Not only battered prints, but a more serious hazard worried people: fire. A tragic fire in Paris in 1897 at a charity film show attended by the aristocracy killed 140 people. Laws were passed which led to more purpose-built cinemas. For a few coins you had a degree of comfort, women could feel safe, and there was music and sometimes the reassuring presence of a fireman. By far the most admired of the early films were those by Georges Méliès. This is Méliès himself. In 1896, Méliès built the first proper film studio, near Paris, where he made a vast number of astonishingly inventive films. Méliès did virtually everything. He even built his own camera, because Lumiere wouldn't sell him one, and like Buster Keaton 20 years later, he plays every member of an orchestra himself. Edward VII's coronation, cameras were not allowed in Westminster Abbey, so distributor Charles Urban commissioned Méliès, who obligingly faked it all in his little studio. His films were often coloured by hand, and even more often they were illicitly copied, especially in America, where they had an enormous success.
Discovery Channel will return to Cinema Europe. Returns to Cinema Europe.
The pioneer Léon Gaumont in France saw the potential of the new moving picture. He manufactured equipment and film stock as well as producing films. His rival was the Pathé Company, whose symbol was the cockerel and whose vast output included trick films to compete with Méliès. In Germany, filmmakers were taking the first steps towards the kind of fantasy for which they would one day be renowned. Showered with magic coins, the peasant girl is transformed and sets off for an enchanted land. Germany's leading pioneer producer was Oskar Mester. Like all film people, Mester knew the drawing power of sex, artistically presented to avoid censorship. 20 years before the accepted arrival of sound, he and other producers presented talking pictures using the gramophone. That the pioneers could produce any sort of synchronization at this early stage was amazing. But amplification was the problem. Although before the system was abandoned, some remarkable results were achieved. Exhibitors had long hoped for a wealthier class of patron, so films were made to resemble lavishly mounted stage plays. France's greatest actress, Sarah Bernhardt, recognized the new status of the cinema. It was this hour-long production which introduced the feature film to America. In England, filmmaking was still a cottage industry. In the garden of this house at Walton-on-Thames was built the first studio of Cecil Hepworth, the most important of the pioneer producers. His small company began with hundreds of short films like this comedy of 1901 about the misadventures of a plumber. Hepworth had a dog called Blair and a baby called Barbara, and he put them both into a film in which a gypsy steals the baby and the dog sets out to find her. This simple film depended more than ever on editing to tell the story, and it set a new standard for the many chase and suspense films which followed. Cecil Hepworth played in it, and it was directed by Llewyn Fitzhayman. Total production costs £7 and 13 shillings and 9pence. Returning to an anxious Mrs. Hepworth is the dog and, triumphantly, the baby. Hepworth sold so many prints around the world, the negative wore out, and he had to remake it twice more to keep up with demand. The great pioneer Charles Pathé, on the right, with his partner Ferdinand Zecker. Zecker combined creativity with a strong commercial streak. For audiences all over Europe, Pathé was the dominant company for the sheer quality of their productions. This, an advance even on Méliès, was made for Pathé by the Spaniard Segundo de Chaumont. Pathé colour films used a stencil colour process involving an assembly line of women at the Pathé factory in Vincennes. Other countries had their own systems. Italy was able to achieve this high standard with hand colouring before adopting a process similar to Pathé's. When the first Russian Revolution broke out in 1905, Ferdinand Zecca reenacted it. A shot of a real Russian battleship was followed by a reenactment of the mutiny aboard the battleship Potemkin. Audiences were then confronted by a horrifying massacre. It may look obvious to us, but how were people then to know this was staged? Filmmakers were exploiting the thin line between fiction and reality. 1910 saw the launching of the weekly newsreels. Gaumont's coverage of the siege of Sydney Street in 1911 caught the tension of an exceptionally violent event. Troops and police besieged a house harbouring Russian anarchists accused of killing policemen. In command, Winston Churchill, the Home Secretary. With her maritime supremacy, Britain was the world's centre of distribution. But her production was now less effective than in other countries like Italy. The Italians recreated the ancient world with resources that were the envy of Americans like D.W. Griffith. The fall of Troy, the retreat from Moscow. Italian cinema won a reputation for the high standard of its photography and the convincing way it recreated its distant past. But hardly anyone matched the technical skill of the Danish filmmakers. And they made the decision to avoid costume drama. The Nordisk studios in Copenhagen were, after Pathé, the largest film producers in Europe. They were established by Ole Olsen in 1906. His policy was up-to-the-minute stories and longer films. August Blom directed one about the white slave traffic, which included this triptych. All three elements had to be combined in the camera. And this was 1910. The film was set in London, and its melodrama was sensational. It was so popular, Nordisk made a sequel, then another, and another. Ole Olsen quickly saw the potential of the export market. For this film, Nordisk shot a happy ending for America and Western Europe, and for the Russians, a tragic ending. Asta Nielsen was a minor theatrical actress in Denmark when she appeared in The Abyss. She had a naturalism and an erotic quality which were rare in the cinema of 1910. Denmark's censorship was more liberal than in most countries. Like so many Danes, she was tempted to Berlin, where producer Paul Davidson built a studio for her. By 1912, Nielsen was Europe's most famous film actress, and cinemas were named after her. The Germans took her to their hearts, and in this film she plays the daughter of a general who gives her a trip in a Zeppelin. This Zeppelin inaugurated the first airline linking major German cities, and from it were filmed these aerial shots of the Ruhr. Pastor Nielsen took advantage of the occasion to drop 5,000 leaflets advertising a new cinema. Film companies exploited the latest and fastest machines, and chases became more mechanized and more inventive. Had been a source of comedy in France. Comedy at this period was as anarchic as society was stiff and formal. This Italian parody of the tango craze appears to send actors and camera on a merry-go-round. Comedies became yet more frenetic. Director-comedian Léonce Perret believed in calm and stillness. His domestic comedies were thus made more believable. Here he returns home from the studio and his wife detects a woman's hair. She tells him she found 2 more on his overcoat. By 1913, the king of comedy was Max Linder. He had started in 1905 and quickly became the first star comedian. He was one of the most imaginative filmmakers. Linder had been writing and directing his own films for 2 years, and he provided them with an astonishing degree of comic invention. He brought an elegance to screen comedy which was too often criticized for its crudeness. And he turned out his short comedies at the rate of 1 a week. Linder was a major inspiration to Chaplin, who made this film of their meeting in 1917 and who called him my professor.
Discovery Channel will return to Cinema Europe. To Cinema Europe.
1913 saw European films reach new heights. The Italian cinema was preeminent with historical epics. Quo Vadis gathered all the publicity, but The Last Days of Pompeii was the artistic triumph of the year. In fact, there were two versions, and both were huge successes in America. Italian industrialists poured money into the cinema. By 1913, there were 200 studios and 3 films released every day. There was employment for crowds of extras, and the cinema became a source of pride for a country otherwise so poor. In production in 1913 was Italy's greatest epic. Its design and imagery were unprecedented, and for years in American studios, tracking shots like this were referred to as Cabiria movements. The plot involved human sacrifice to the god Moloch. Larger audiences for such epics needed bigger cinemas. The Gaumont Palace in Paris seated 3,500, and longer films were needed to fill these bigger cinemas. This one lasted nearly 2 hours. It was the story of the kidnapping of a little girl and her rescue. It was directed by Léonce Perret, the comedian, who proved himself the equal of any dramatic director. The kidnappers unite the girl with her father and then demand more money. The Danes produced another master director in Benjamin Christensen, who played with light as though he'd discovered it, for this spy drama set in an imaginary war. In France, director Alfred Machin produced this warning against war in pavé color. The story of aviators, it was made when the military considered aeroplanes suitable for little more than reconnaissance, and no air-to-air combat had happened at all. For pre-war audiences, this was science fiction. The release of this Danish pacifist film in 1914 was ironic. Directed by Holger Madsen, it all too accurately forecast the misery which lay ahead. Scripted by Carl Dreyer, a great director of the future, who would be renowned for scenes like this, it was intended for the International Peace Congress to be held in Vienna in September 1914. The Congress was cancelled by an event in the Balkans. The last pictures of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo before his assassination. A bomb has already been thrown at him, and at the town hall his driver checks the car for damage. 3 minutes after leaving the town hall he would be dead, and Europe and its film industry would be changed forever. Even the Kaiser, who worshipped militarism, was alarmed at the way events were going. Austro-Hungary had already mobilized against Serbia. France mobilized on August the 1st. 3 days later, Germany declared war on France, a scene recreated by Paul Lenny in 1916. As thousands left the front, France's film industry was paralyzed overnight. Military authorities regarded moving pictures as suitable for target practice and little else. The British Army ordered cameras to be kept away from the war zone. It was felt undignified for the services to be portrayed for the delectation of foreigners. The newsreels covered the effects of war, if not the war itself, advertising their scoops with unhealthy glee. The British government recognized the importance of propaganda, but saw no role for films. Animated cartoons and illustrated maps were as far as they went. It took an entire year to convince the services that film was a good idea, and the result was one film about preparations for war. The lack of real war footage led film people to create their own. The Zeppelin menace was now a reality. But this fake newsreel of a Zeppelin raid over England was hardly different from the trick film of 1909. This battle from a German propaganda film probably had military assistance. For the Germans were the first to begin to realize the usefulness of film. German propaganda was not aggressive. They wanted to ingratiate themselves with those they were occupying. Germans discovered the cinema during the war, and they discovered Lubitsch. Ernst Lubitsch was a Jewish comic who became a director. He had a unique talent, and what later became known as the Lubitsch touch was already apparent in his early comedies. The war would deprive France of its best-loved comedian, Max Linder, who had been wounded as a military driver and was soon to leave for America. Italy came into the war in May 1915 on the Allied side, and this propaganda film shows how their world-famous strongman, Maciste, copes with the Austrian enemy. Italy, which had been so admired, was forced to scale down production. The Caesar Company produced a forerunner of neo-realism. Filmed on the streets of Naples, it featured and was co-directed by Francesca Bertini, the foremost diva of Italy, famous for her emotional roles, who surprised her followers with a totally naturalistic performance. Lydia Borelli sustained the performances of operatic passion more in keeping with the diva. She gave a new word to the Italian language, Borellismo. In England, a children's matinee, but children or adults, cinemas were packed to capacity for the first time. To show England, the England of tradition, the England the troops were fighting for, was considered essential. Directed by Rex Wilson, this film was chosen for the first Royal Command performance. The royal beauty of France was captured on the screen with a greater sense of urgency, for so much had disappeared since the war began. The Camargue, in the south of France, with many other locations, had been used in Zigoma, the precursor of the serial. Packed with action, the serial became a favorite with audiences all over the world. Wartime Paris was riveted by serials. In Les Vampires, directed by Louis Fayard, thieves used sleeping gas to immobilize a society party. Poison gas had first been used by the Germans on the Western Front only a few months earlier. German equivalent was homunculus, a man created in a laboratory who tries to take over the world.
Discovery Channel will return to Cinema Europe. To Cinema Europe.
The War Office were now enthusiastic about films. Army officers were taught to handle film equipment at the Hepworth Company. The Canadian Lord Beaverbrook, soon to be Minister of Information, was an enthusiast for films. He commissioned a fleet of army trucks equipped with film projectors to carry the propaganda message to the most outlying villages and army camps. Films were even shown at front-line cinemas in France, some of which carried on even though shattered by shell fire and barely upright. The most popular were Chaplin films and westerns. But the soldiers particularly enjoyed war films. They would roar with laughter at films like this Danish production, modelled more on Griffith's recent Civil War epic, The Birth of a Nation, than on real warfare. The real thing bore little resemblance, but it had been captured on film. The German coverage was particularly impressive because combat units armed with cameras were sent into action by a new photographic bureau for the armed forces, BUFA, Bild- und Filmamt. They made a film about the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, and the air aces on the Western Front. In one astonishing scene, an automatic camera mounted on a wing records air-to-air combat with a British plane. When the Americans entered the war in 1917, they showed the world what could be done with film propaganda. They cleared enemy films from neutral countries by warning them they would get no Charlie Chaplin films if they ran any German pictures. The Kaiser and his high command were disturbed by the damage caused by this propaganda. General Ludendorff wrote a document which became the foundation of a new company, UFA. It is of the utmost importance that films be made to work with the greatest possible effect. Ludendorff wanted a national propaganda machine. The bankers saw it as a chance to get their hands on state money. The filmmakers used it to make the films they wanted to make. For years, German cinema had been dominated by the Danish Nordisk Company. Now UFA, by taking over its distribution network, ended this. Yet surprisingly, UFA distributed this previously banned Nordisk pacifist film, which showed a brave nurse setting out to stop the war. Danish cinema had reached its zenith with a film by Benjamin Christensen, seen here. It was more imaginatively shot than almost anything being made at the time. A girl in a lonely house fears an intruder. Loss of its Central European market led to the demise of Denmark as a film-producing country. In its place would rise a new German industry, whose foundation would be UFA, formed from many disparate companies, like the one that made this film, with Paul Wegener. As a propaganda machine, outra failed utterly. Even appeals for war bonds like this came from elsewhere. The German army had already invaded Britain in motorized convoys, according to Herbert Brennan. This Irish-American director was brought in by the British government to produce a great propaganda film on the German invasion, tying up hundreds of soldiers and probably saving their lives in the process. Ellen Terry, the greatest actress of the British stage, plays a mother whose son has won the Victoria Cross, but who has to be told of his death. The film was overtaken by the armistice and scrapped. 4 years of war had shattered Europe, and one of the casualties was its film industry. With the loss of its world markets, it surrendered to Hollywood. With so many millions dead, Europe was at its lowest point. If its cinema had lost its commercial power, the war had given it a new vision. In the last days of the war, Abel Gance had begun a pacifist epic. Watched by a soldier poet, Jean Diaz, the dead rise up to confront the living. Diaz calms the terrified population, but then demands to know if the great sacrifice had been worthwhile. Have you profited from the war? What have you done since your husband was killed? I accuse. When Gance was shooting this scene, a general asked him, "Who are you accusing?" "I am accusing war," he replied. "I am accusing man. I am accusing universal stupidity."